Welcome to this RSAA webinar. Today, we're fortunate to have three exceptional speakers. Saul Estrin, Emeritus Professor of Managerial Economics and Strategy at the London School of Economics, Simon Commander, Managing Partner of Altera Partners and Visiting Professor of Economics at IE Business School in Madrid, and Vasuki Shastry, Global Head of Public Affairs at Standard Chartered Bank and an Associate Fellow of the Asia Pacific Programme at Chatham House. All three of our panelists flagged up challenges to the future of Asian capitalism. Saul Estrin and Simon Commander most recently in their book, The Connections World, published last year, and Vasuki Shastry in his own book, Has Asia Lost It?, about which he spoke to the RSAA last June. It was common not so long ago to talk about the 21st century as the Asian century. And there is no doubt that the last 2 decades have witnessed a massive growth in the economic importance of a number of Asian countries. But as we will hear, there are reasons to question whether that is a trend that can continue without significant change. We're going to hear from each of our panelists, and they will then take questions. But please use the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen to post questions that you would like the panelists to answer, and we will do our best to address them all. And I will start by giving the floor to Saul Estrin to start today's event. Saul.
Actually, Simon will go first and I'll go second. Sorry about that, Michael. I should have said.
Right. Good afternoon to everyone, or wherever you are. We're going to share the slideshow, and I'm going to kick it off, and then Saul will take over. And as Michael has kindly mentioned, our book came out at the end of last year, The Connections World, The Future of Asian Capitalism, published by Cambridge University Press. It came out at the end of last year in Europe, the UK, and indeed in most of Asia, and this year in February, March in North America. And we're very delighted to present it to such a distinguished venue and to, I'm sure, many distinguished and interested persons. So let me, without further ado, get going. Our book it's published by an academic press, and it has, both of us are, in a sense, primarily academics, but the book is an attempt to deal with the issues about the future of Asia and its economies in what we hope is an accessible way. And rather than asking relatively narrow questions and then trying to address them by way of modeling or econometric analysis, our book asks some large questions and then tries to address them through a combination of use of economic statistics with also a great deal of interpretation. And unlike many economics books, the nature of our subject means that a lot of what we are talking about, describing and analyzing is not necessarily sitting there on the surface waiting to be analyzed, because many of these businesses and the components of the connections world proceed, if not by stealth, then certainly in ways that are not that transparent and certainly not accessible. So the book also uses a considerable amount of not exactly anecdotes, but stories, examples taken from a variety of sources. So let me get going. The book's about 2-3 really big questions. What explains Asia's extraordinary success? Because certainly for me, a development economist, there's no doubting that Asia is the great success of the last century and this. The second is, what is likely to be Asia's future, its prospects? Will it, as Michael's already alluded, ensure that Asia will be the story of the 21st century? Or are there features in these economies and political systems that may imperil that? And to cut to the quick, in our book, we argue that some of the factors that have driven Asia's success over the past 50, 60 years may not necessarily drive it forward in quite the same way and with quite the same positive consequences. Now, the first point to make, I think, is that Asia's impressive performance and success has been achieved through a combination of policies and business configurations that are not really the same as those in the so-called advanced economies or rich world, or indeed even in those economies as they rose up the ladder. Rather, Asia's been characterized by the application of public and industrial policies, South Korea being perhaps the most striking example, along with a reliance on a particular form of business, something that we don't find in the UK, and in fact, very rarely find in the rich world at all, namely business groups. I'll come back to that in a minute. Now, the public policy that has been so important is often reduced simply to the so-called picking winners strategy of vertical industrial policy. That's, in other words, going to sectors, saying we will throw resources at them, we'll build them up. And as I mentioned, South Korea is a prime example of that. But in the book, we argue that something else has been going on, much more tacit than explicit. And that is a compact that links big business, mainly business groups, to the state and to government in ways that ensure coordination, which undoubtedly is good and one factor behind Asia's success, but also ensures a rather unhealthy relationship between big business and government. And these connections that run, and the networks of connections that run between business and politicians, we call in the book the connections world. So let me move on to that. So the next slide, please, Saul. Now, at the apex of what we call the connections world are political parties, individual politicians, businesses, and in particular, these business groups. They relate in a highly transactional way. Politicians, as always, look for campaign contributions, jobs, and so on and so on. Firms look for protection from competition, subsidies, loans, often from state-owned banks, public sector contracts, and permits and licenses. In a country like India, for example, most sectors require some form of permit and license, and thereby enters the government in one form or the other. Next slide, please. Now, this is not really a story about cronyism in the narrow sense of the term. A lot has been written about how X and Y are connected to Q and Z and so on. But this is really much more about the network nature. And we map these in the book, and I'm going to come to some rather beautiful diagrams about that mapping. But the networks that we describe and analyze are, it should be pointed out, very adaptive, they're very purposive, and their consequences and ways of functioning go way beyond those, the actions of particular cronyist transactions. In other words, the webs of connections bind together with common purpose and common ways of organizing and operating. And this cuts across economies, whether at different levels of income or with different political systems. Because after all, in Asia, and by the way, in the book in Asia, we are primarily referring to what is rather inadequately called middle income Asia. We're not really talking about Laos, Cambodia, Nepal, Bhutan, and so on. Well, not Bhutan, but we're talking about the big Asian countries, India, China, Southeast Asia, and East Asia. Now, in that grouping, you will obviously immediately understand that they're very different political systems. And this does affect how these networks look and how they operate. So in China and Vietnam, the unique party system means that the party sits at the center of these networks, and most of the links or ties run off the party. And therefore, much of what is central and strategic in these networks is occurring between relatively few players. However, having said that, whether it's in China, Vietnam, India, or Indonesia, many of those players are private sector individuals or companies. Roll the clock back 40 years ago, and most of the action would have been between political parties, politicians, and state-owned enterprises. That is certainly no longer the case. Next slide, please. The maps that we have in the book we put up two. They're for every country, and no prizes for guessing which is China and which is India. China, as I mentioned, the party at the center, functionaries around it, and then a whole group of state-owned enterprises, as well as the green, which are private enterprises, and black private individuals. And because there are lots of observations in there, something like 175,000, you can't see the links between them. But this mapping basically has links that run between them, and that those links may be politicians being board members or companies getting contracts and so on, a whole variety of ways in which they're all tied up. On the right, looking at the screen, you see India, a couple of the major parties, the national parties, and then a whole bunch of regional parties. Again, some SOEs, but declining significance, and some private enterprises and businesses, as well as individuals. Next slide, please. Now, I've already mentioned that when we look at that map and we look at private businesses, we're not, for the most part, looking at standalone businesses in the UK or European sense of the term. We're really talking, for the most part, about business groups. And these are not the same as so-called rich world conglomerates. They're mostly family. They're often dynastic, several generations. They are very, very diversified, which is quite peculiar. We'll come back to that. And once they get in the game, they tend not to go away. They're very persistent. They're organized with pyramid-like structures, and these allow their owners, the families in other words, for the most part, levels of control that far exceed their levels of actual ownership. This means that minority shareholders are constantly at a disadvantage. Funneling of resources in and around the groups is generally much easier than it probably ought to be. And these structures, we argue very importantly, help deter predators, both political predators, people who might want to, might not like them from the political sphere, might want to nationalize them or take some of their assets, but also business predators, people who might want to buy them. Next slide, please. Now, why do business groups exist in such an important way in Asia? And they've been around for a very long time, and there's a great big academic literature on this. And most of it, the arguments for why they exist go back to those of Ronald Coase and others, who essentially pinpoint missing or incomplete markets and the way in which business groups can address those gaps, either, for example, by having their own pocket banks or associated banks to fill the gaps in capital markets, or by creating managerial cadres. For instance, Tata's very early on set up an administrative system within the group to address the problem of shortage of managers and skilled workers, skilled personnel. But we argue that if that were the case, then the less missing and less incomplete markets that undoubtedly exist, whether for capital or skills or management or whatever, should have led to a dwindling or decline in the incidence of business groups in Asia. Not a bit of it. In point of fact, if anything, they have grown. And we argue that the reason why they not only hang around, but actually have consolidated, is because they are ideally suited for the connections world, for connecting to politicians. They provide concentrated points of contact. They facilitate dealing with politicians, and politicians like it. They only have a few people that they need to get on the phone to or to transact with. And sometimes this can even be very useful for national or developmental goals. South Korea and Samsung being a perfect case in hand. Now, apart from hanging around and weathering political storms, Indonesia is the case in point, these business groups are also tremendously good, not just at concentrating business and market power, which we'll come to in a few minutes, but also wealth. So Samsung now accounts for over 22% of South Korea's GDP, and the son of the founder of the group recently left an estate of over 21 billion. In Thailand, where I've just been, the CP Group's owners, the Caravan family, have a consolidated wealth of around 25 billion, and again, are an important, very important part of the Thai economy. Next slide, please. Now, if this consultation between the state and business groups in particular, has proven a very useful way of building their economies over the last 50 years through the power of coordination and resource allocation. As incomes have risen and growth has accelerated, the connections world, we argue in the book, and we must evidence for this, has actually become more entrenched. In other words, it hasn't faded away. It hasn't sort of given rise to more competition amongst businesses and more entrants. Rather, it's led to more entrenchment on these incumbents. And in the book, we argue that this is something that is not wholly desirable by any means. In fact, it's storing up problems for the future. And these can be grouped into three main components with a couple of additional ones. The bullets there said, but let me summarize. The attenuation of competition, which constrains productivity. And this is a very fundamental point, we feel. The second is in helping ensure pervasive dualism in the labor market and in other markets, but particularly in employment. And what do I mean by that? I mean the perpetuation of informality, of low-end, low-productivity jobs, sitting alongside a very thin sliver of high-quality, high-productivity jobs, mostly in business groups. And the third, which may be the most important dynamically, well, certainly in interaction with competition, is that we argue that the connections world may hold back the shift to an economy based on innovation. And the reason why that is important, and here I will hand over to Saul, is that for the most part over the last 50, 60 years, Asian growth has been delivered by the greater application of capital and labor, what economists call extensive growth. Now, the limits to that have already been reached in some of the richer countries, South Korea, Malaysia, China indeed. And although they have by no means been reached in South Asia, for instance, they nevertheless, the margin for exploiting that growth process is shrinking. And therefore, as a consequence, Asia, like other economies, will need to become more innovative. So now to look more towards the future, I hand over to Saul.
Thank you, Simon. So I'm going to really unpack those 3 points, competition, employment, and innovation in more detail. Let's start with competition. The connections world is using academic jargon, is a political economy equilibrium. Neither the businesses nor the politicians that are engaged in it really have strong incentives to change anything. From their point of view, it's a win-win sort of situation. But that means that they're not very interested, neither side is very interested in allowing new competitors to enter any markets. And as a result of that, entry barriers for new firms can be very high. Those barriers can be traditional economic ones of market power and scale, or they could be regulatory through government action, or through subsidy, or indeed through controls on international competition from international firms, either through FDI or through importing. So entry barriers are high. Exit, if you think of the Schumpeterian view of creative destruction, where productivity rises by the replacement of more efficient firms entering and less efficient firms exiting, all of this is skewed by the whole structure of business groups which are constructed essentially for the purposes of their dynastic owner, the family in charge. And there's a lot of evidence that business groups do a lot of cross-subsidizing, which can restrict or eliminate exit by poorly performing or inefficient firms if those firms play some other role within the purpose of the business group. And that's done, as Simon's already indicated, by intra-group transfers. It used to be through tunneling. Now we see a lot more of it. There's been a lot in the press in, say, India about corporate debt transfers, or by many other mechanisms across the group. So those are the things that make one in principle worried about competition in the connections world. We think that there's two areas of competition you need to think about, however, in the connections world. When we're used to the idea that competition is limited when there aren't many firms. I mean, in a country like the UK, the government will intervene when, I don't know, when Tesco gets more than 30% of the market, it is no longer allowed to expand. And indeed, at times, it's forced to sell or close some of its shops. Similarly, in 2008, when Lloyds took over some of the bankrupt banks in the financial crash, it had to separate its TSB operation in order not to breach a share of the market, which is typically seen in the UK and in the US to be around 30%. So your first concern will be there shouldn't be too few firms in a market. Now, the thing about business groups is that problem is amplified because, unlike, as Simon said, in Western economies, firms sprawl across sectors. If we look at, we're doing at the moment some work on India, and many business groups operate in between 50 and more than 100 sectors simultaneously. So your worry is not only the impact of the business group within a sector, but the possibility that the business group will be dominant across a significant part of the economy, or indeed the whole economy. And we call that idea of domination in the whole economy overall concentration. And when we did some empirical work, we did indeed find a very serious problem. So if we look at a country like the United States, where, as you know, the big four firms are not small, no one accuses Amazon or Apple of being small businesses, and they're big players within their markets. But nonetheless, because they operate within one sector, their share of the US economy is, taken together, the top five firms, is minuscule. It's around 3%. Whereas if we look at a country like South Korea, those top five firms represent nearly 30% of GDP. In Thailand, it's more than 25%. And even in really enormous economies like India or China, just five firms represent over 10% of the whole GDP of the country. So, and of course, when we look instead at largest 10 firms, these are popped up, increased even more. So in a place like India, 10 firms represents not quite 20%, but not far from 20% of the whole country's GDP. And that compares in the US with about 3.5%. So there's clearly a big monopoly power problem coming from the connections world, which is much greater than we have seen historically in the West or we see currently in the West. Let's turn quickly to employment. Simon's made this point, and I don't want to spend too long in it. We're not arguing that the business groups do not create good jobs. By good jobs, we mean jobs which are productive and are well paid. The problem is they create them in rather limited numbers. When we look at the share of GDP of the business groups, say in India, we're seeing for the top five firms, we're seeing that at over 10%. But when we look at employment, it's far, far less. It's 1%. So what's going on here is that the business groups themselves don't, though they create good jobs, don't employ a lot of people. They have supply chains of smaller firms, many of them in the informal economy. And many of those firms, indeed most of those firms, are very low in productivity and have do not generate good jobs. So the impact of the connections world in the labour market is to create a dual labour market, as Simon said, where you've got a relatively small group of work, relatively small, obviously it's millions of people in these big economies, but a relatively small group of workers who are productive in well-paid jobs. But most employment and most job creation is in the informal sector or in small firms. And because of the problems of market competition that I talked about just now, typically those small firms do not grow. They are operating in the shadow or under the tree in the shade created by business groups. And so what we see all over Asia is a missing middle of firms, a limited number of large firms with employment, a small number, huge number of small firms, most of them informal, and very few firms growing through ranks. Thirdly, I want to turn to innovation. I just want to repeat and bring out what Simon said before. Asia's success in part can be, I think, linked to the business group or to the connections world, because business groups working with politicians have been able to concentrate resources on core sectors to generate growth. And this has been as a miraculous process almost in the last 50 years. As these countries have moved towards the frontier in terms of technology, in China in terms of manufacturing, in India particularly in terms of areas like pharmaceuticals or software and other sectors like that, as they move to the frontier, growth no longer relies on imitation and the application of capital and labor to known technologies, but the development of new technologies, new processes, and new products, innovation. And the question you've got to ask is, how good is the connections world going to be at providing that sort of innovation? And I want to stress at the beginning that a priori, the arguments are nuanced. It's not straightforward. Very imperfect market conditions can still allow innovation so that firms can escape from constricting competition. It's often argued in the United States that they allow a lot of market power is given to the large tech firms like Google or Amazon, simply because the key mechanism for competition is seen to be innovation, and they need that scale in order to generate the resources to innovate. So it is possible that innovation can occur even with this imperfect market structure. It's also the case, the connections world, as we've said, few firms, focused government, and though we can therefore see relationships whereby the government supports innovation. We see this perhaps less so in places like Thailand and Indonesia and India, but more so in China and Korea. And of course, these pyramidal structures do allow the groups to move money around. So if they want to do innovation, they've got the resources to it, right? Our argument, however, is that these high levels of market power, these high level of political connections have a tendency nonetheless to promote rent-seeking over innovation. And this is what we see to be one of the two fundamental problems for innovation in the connections world. The second is, if you look deeply at the processes that drive successful innovation, they are based on trial and error. It's not that a new firm comes in and immediately succeeds. It's that lots and lots of firms create lots of related products and pivot and change their way, and very gradually the market focuses on a standard. And the connections world is really ill-suited to that sort of trial and error process for the simple reason that entry and indeed exit are highly restricted in this sort of world. We've got evidence on this. Our evidence suggests that innovation is indeed higher in affiliates than non-affiliates, but we believe that should be the case because, of course, the business groups are much better resourced than non-business groups. Our argument is that business groups hold back innovation in the aggregate of the economy because they crowd out non-affiliated firms, limiting access to finance, reducing returns to innovation, and suppressing an entry and exit. So while business groups themselves innovate quite a lot, our argument is that these economies are not typically innovating as much as you'd expect. And here is some evidence for that. Here we're looking at GDP per capita as against R&D spending across the whole world, almost every economy in the world. And this line gives an idea of the relationship. So that tells you essentially how much R&D expenditure you would expect, given the level of development in each country. And what you see is that basically none of the Asian countries are really out of where you would expect them to be, right? Asia is not highly spending on R&D. The only exception to that on the plus side is South Korea, and countries like the Philippines and Indonesia are punching below their weight. And when we look at patterns here, right, we see the same phenomenon. South Korea is an outlier. The rest of Asia is either below or more or less at where you would expect it to be. So though while one reads a lot about Asian innovation, and indeed there are many individual success stories, we're really not saying there's no innovation in Asia, right? We're saying that the connections world leads Asia, on average, not to outperform, with the exception of Korea. I probably outrun my time nearly, so I'm going to go very quickly. The book ends at some length with what can be done about this. I think it's really important to stress we are not saying that Asia is going to stop growing and the future for Asia is bad, right? What we're saying is that we're trying to analyze what really was going on in the process for growth, whether it's fit for purpose going forwards, and if, as we argue, it is not, what policies might help to try and address these weaknesses. And we have a large discussion. I won't spend a lot of time on this now, given the time. Maybe we can pick it up in questioning. But essentially, we do argue that the business groups have to be broken up or outlawed in the way that was done in the United States by Roosevelt in the New Deal, in the way that MacArthur did in Japan after World War II, and in the way that the UK did in the 1960s through corporate governance laws. And this involves prohibitions on pyramids and related party transactions and the way, the whole structure that defines a business group. We also believe, and South Korea has been the most successful at trying to address this, that inheritance taxes will be very important because they will force the families essentially to sell their holdings and break up their holdings and to focus the business group down to core businesses, as we are beginning to see, but slowly. We see there's a big role for competition policy. And on the other side, we see an enormous need for greater transparency on the political side, so that the other side of the connections world, the politics side of the connections, can also be brought into line. So with that, I think we can stop our presentation and hand on to Vasuki.
Thanks a lot, Saul. Thanks a lot, Simon. I thoroughly enjoyed reading the book. I think it sets a very, very good economic framework on really targeting middle-income countries in Asia and the profound economic, social, and political challenges that they face. I want to focus my comments on the consequences, particularly with the political economy lens, since you've laid out this econometric case extremely well. So let me just explore 4 or 5 issues. I want to leave enough time for Q&A, so I'm going to be brief in my comments. I think Middle-income Asia's first problem has to do with political leadership. And there is a sense, given this very, very compelling presentation that both of you have done, on the notion of elite capture, that the fact that you've got an ossified political leadership in many of these countries, which have deep connections with big business, and they're essentially preventing fresh ideas from germinating. And when you have this level of elite capture, it's very hard for new political parties and new political entities to rise. So if you take a look at India, you'll take a look at Thailand, we'll see what happens with the elections coming up soon. Prime Minister Modi was legitimately elected on a democratic platform, right? So there's no doubt about that. But at the same time, since coming to power in 2014, he's been an aggregator and consolidator of power, not very different from Xi Jinping in China, right? And there was a time, I think, in recent Indian history when comparing Indian political leadership and Chinese political leadership, it's essentially like Mars and Venus, very, very different. But right now, you actually have a common thread in looking at how these two very different political systems has given rise to common typologies in leadership, close links with certain favored business groups. In China's case, of course, it is the state-owned enterprises. But when you have this level of elite capture, and you place this against the demographic challenge that, outside of China, Korea, Japan, of course, Asia is skewing younger, right? So there's a demographic sweet spot that countries like India, Philippines, and Indonesia are facing. So there's this wide gap between the ruler and the ruled. I did some analysis in my book on a simple analysis in my book on the year of birth of a majority of Asian heads of state and government. Many of them were born during the radio and telegraph era of the 1940s and 1950s. Some of them, of course, when Prime Minister Mahathir was briefly in power, went all the way to the 1920s as well. And the population is skewing younger. So you've got this widening divide between the ruler and the ruled, which I think will have consequences if you combine this particularly with the lack of a level playing field. And if you don't have a level playing field and you essentially have a group of favored business tycoons who are able to capture the most lucrative parts of a country's business, I think there's a direct impact on social mobility. There's a direct impact on job creation. And if you look at much of the World Bank data on social mobility trends in East Asia and South Asia, more recently in the last 5 to 10 years, there are definite signs that it is stalling. And one of the great wonders of the East Asian miracle of the 1960s and 70s is how the focus on distribution. Of course, there was a focus on delivering high economic growth through an export-oriented strategy. There was, of course, a focus on a small group of businesses who were given incentives to lead in that strategy. But at the same time, there was a distributive element in East Asia's economic gains, particularly in Japan, Korea, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and Singapore, which is visibly absent in other parts of middle-income Asia, which I think will have consequences. If you don't have adequate social mobility, and at the same time your economy is not creating quality jobs, and this has manifested itself in both in India and in China. In China, of course, you've got this lying flat phenomenon where a section of the youth simply don't want to enter the job market. They're completely disincentivized. In India, on the other hand, you have a phenomenon of the Indian Railway advertising for 100 jobs and getting multiples of millions applicants for these positions, which really shows that job creation should be very much part of the leadership challenge, but it's falling through the cracks. One thing that we also need to discuss is the lack of governance capacity. And when we looked at East Asia, you looked at the East Asian miracle economies, one always marveled at the command and control governance capabilities, which enable the state not only to allocate resources to sectors which are growing very fast, but also to demonstrate to the common man that the state was able to deliver tangible social benefits from high economic growth rates. And we've seen in the pandemic, in the context of the pandemic, many of Asian countries stumbled in managing the pandemic, right? When we look at India, Indonesia, the Philippines, you had these governance missteps, which really exacerbated the pandemic problem. So it raises fundamental questions. I don't know if Simon and Saul have done research on linking elite capture, these connections between business and politics, what impact that has on governance capacity, capability, and delivery of public goods. I think certainly an interesting area of research to explore in the future. And I also want to talk a little bit about innovation at the end. There's a wonderful book written over 2 decades ago by Gurcharan Das in India, which essentially said India grows at night. And I think because of this capture between politicians and a favored group of tycoons, there's very little capability for innovation, as Simon and Saul sketched out. But at the same time, smaller businesses have been able to identify gaps and weaknesses and enter businesses when the government is essentially asleep at the wheel. And I think the success of India's IT services industry, more than 250 billion strong in terms of revenues this year, I think simply happened because the Indian government at the time was not looking at IT services as a growth area. Similarly, I think if you look at the rise of the Alibabas and the Tencents in China, this happened against the backdrop where China regarded the state still to be at the commanding heights of the economy and didn't perhaps focus too much of time on the capacity of e-commerce, for example. And the fact that China now has moved in a very intrusive way in seizing control over many of these private sector champions shows that, aggregation and consolidation of power is the primary focus of leadership in many Asian countries. So all in all, I don't want to end on a dispiriting note. I think a lot of the focus has to be in the future on the demographic sweet spot that many of these countries can achieve. Focus on younger business leaders, focus on younger political leaders who will be able to speak up to the aspirations of this hundreds of millions of young people across the region, and to figure out an exit path for the gerontocratic business and political leadership now at the helm in middle-income Asia. Michael, I think I should pause here to take some questions.
Wonderful, thank you to all of you. I will get the ball rolling, but members of the audience, please do put in your questions too. A lot of what all three of you have been talking about is, of course, the relationship between the state and business, and how closely that functions, or sometimes doesn't, and where the balance of benefit lies. It's slightly sort of off the script, if you like, but I'm reminded that at a time when I was dealing with issues in Sudan, I had a Chinese counterpart. We were talking about a terrorist attack on an oil installation in Algeria. I don't know if you remember this, but there was great alarm because lots of countries discovered that they had citizens at risk in this area, and they hadn't been paying attention to it particularly. And my Chinese counterpart said, yes, that the Chinese government had been very troubled to discover that, that there was sort of $2 billion worth of Chinese investments at risk in this area. And then they did some research and they discovered that actually, no, they didn't have 2 billion at risk. They had 4 billion at risk. And the government had been entirely unaware of the extent of Chinese companies' commitments. And I mean, I mention this because, of course, first of all, in the West, we tend to look at governments, particularly China's, as being entirely sort of monolithic and crawling all over everything that its business community does. But I was very taken by Vasuki's mention of the Indian IT industry as having grown essentially while the government was looking in another direction, slightly the way the British Empire has sometimes been characterized as having been obtained in a fit of absence of mind. And indeed, Xi Jinping's reaction to discovering quite how powerful some of the Jack Ma's in China were, and seeking to control that. So there's an ongoing issue there, clearly, that revolves also around how much the state knows. In the implication of the sort of connections between state and business ought to be that the state knows at the very least a great deal, if not almost everything, about what its business community is doing, and yet that appears not to be the case. And I wondered if any of you had any comments on that. How despite the most centralizing efforts of some governments, still these not all of the connections get spotted.
I'd be willing to jump in feet first on this. I certainly, the point that Vasuki made about the Indian IT sector and about Tencent and Alibaba are indeed quite big themes in the book. And I think we completely agree with the analysis that he gave, that the connections world is not necessarily all-encompassing. And that being said, I'm not sure that I go all the way with what Michael just said. And the reason for that is the connections world. The connections world is not really about the power of the state only. It's about the power of business, where business is not very competitive, is very highly concentrated both within markets and across markets. And then the relationship between business and the state. And that's the pervasive part. So while I think you're absolutely right to say that in situations where the state tries to control everything, it doesn't always do so, right? And I have no objection to that view. I don't think that really counters our argument that these are not very competitive environments, and they're not necessarily very good environments for creating jobs or for generating innovation. Because I think that the firms will do this for the state may not know, but the businesses probably will. And the connections world is both of them. So that's my initial response to your comment.
Thank you, and I think that's very fair. And I hadn't meant to suggest that there was a flaw in the analysis there, as it were. But more, I suppose, that there is a flaw in much Western understanding of how this works. I mean, I wondered if I could just sort of extend that a little bit historically and And none of you mentioned Japan, but of course, Japan in the 1950s, 60s, 70s had the most extraordinary economic story. And I lived in Japan for 2 years, but I do not claim any great understanding of the country. What is striking, I think, is that on some level or other, much of the analysis that you have set out about the sort of business connections, business groups, and so on, seems, at least to me superficially, to be very much a part of Japan's economic story in the earlier stages of its recovery from the Second World War. Is that right, or are there real differences there? I mean, politically, of course, it's different, but I mean, still one saw through the sort of, until relatively recently, an extraordinary concentration of political power in Japan within the Liberal Democratic Party.
Perhaps I could come in on that, Michael, if that's all right. That's a very interesting point, and I also wanted to pick up on a couple of things that Vasuki said in his very interesting discussion. On Japan, I think it was very different for something that Saul mentioned, which was that, of course, MacArthur came along, and the diagnosis of Japanese militarism and the disaster of the war was, among other things, that this sort of military industrial royalist confederation of interests, if you want to put it that way, was something that had to be broken. And of course, in 46 or 47, I can't remember the exact date, that's precisely what happened. And essentially, these family-owned business groups were scrapped and remained off the table for 40 years. The Japanese parliament, the Diet, allowed the recreation of holding companies in 1997, and they have made a re-emergence of sorts, but not in quite the same way. Now, that radical action by MacArthur, which very much drew on the playbook of Roosevelt in the 30s in their own country, in the US, I think did break up these family business groups in their organization. Second important point of Japan was that this was a period of considerable trade liberalization and integration with the rest of the world economy. And we know that, one of the reasons for why, for instance, South Korea, which copied many elements of the Japanese model, has been so successful, as against, for instance, India with its very poorly designed and executed industrial policies. One of the reasons South Korea and Japan have been successful is the role of international competition. So this is a disciplining force. So I think those measures, coupled with something that Saul also mentioned, which was the introduction of a very, very high inheritance tax. Japanese inheritance tax is, I believe, about 55%. The South Koreans is about 50%. And as we know in our country, in the UK, inheritance starts from, 325,000 or whatever it is at about 40%. But 55% is an extremely good deterrent for having businesses family-owned, controlled, and for passing across generations. So that was really, I think, what disrupted things in Japan. A couple of things on Vasuki's immensely interesting points about the discrepancy between these gerontocracies and their youthful citizens, and the sort of parallel paths that they are taking, and the lack of sufficient overlapping interests. I think that is absolutely right. Having said that, I think there are probably quite big pressures, even within the connections world, on politicians to try to bridge that gap. But, and this is a big but, I think it's not just a lack of imagination, but it's also a lack of tools and instruments for achieving it, have meant that policies to address it have been a singular failure for the most part, particularly in employment terms. And I don't really see signs of new and creative thinking right across the region. So this curse of informality and dualism is as relevant in China and Vietnam as it is in India or Bangladesh, for that matter. So these are big issues that don't. And one final quick point: Vasuki's absolutely right. I mean, entrepreneurial businesses, got going when government gaze was directed elsewhere, or they weren't aware. They were new activities, and they were highly entrepreneurial. I mean, Alibaba, Tencent, or Infosys, they're all highly entrepreneurial firms. They started out as such. Now, as you rightly mentioned, certainly in the case of Alibaba and Tencent, they're being heavily reined in. And the Chinese conundrum, of course, is that if you rein in, you may get the political control and the subservience you seek, the absence of alternative sources of power and concentration, but at the same time, you may throttle the drive and the invention and the creativity that made them formidable companies in the first place. So that's a big tension, and we shall have to see how it plays out.
Michael, I just want to quickly come on Japan. And the most interesting aspect of Bank of Japan's monetary policy over the past decade, this extraordinary quantitative easing that they still continuing on with the aim of addressing pervasive deflation and, in a way, and this is Prime Minister Shinzo Abe's efforts to boost the population rate, has distributive effects. And the fact that there's so much of focus on the part of the Japanese government now to bring inflation above 2%, to make sure that firms are increasing wages, I think is an extraordinary example of governments attempting to address political economy issues through econometrics. And, we'll wait and see. I think there's some positive evidence that Japanese firm behavior and consumer behavior is changing as a result of this monetary expansion. This monetary expansion, of course, is not without cost. These costs will play out over a longer period of time. But at the same time, it's very interesting how an advanced economy is using unconventional economic policy to address distribution.
Thank you very much indeed. I think, unfortunately, we need to stop there. We're just coming up to the hour, and we have by no means exhausted this subject. It's been a fascinating discussion, and I'm very grateful to all three of you panelists for giving us your time. I think there's a long way to go with these issues and a lot of things that we haven't touched on. But for now, I just wanted to thank Saul Estrin, Simon Commander, and Vasuki Shastry for giving us their time. And you, the audience, you are the reason we do these events. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. And goodbye for now.